afternoon. I hope everyone got to grab lunch. So my name is Jennifer Georgino, and I'm an advocate in the blockchain space. And I've been in the blockchain and healthcare space for about a year and a half. I'm an active member of HIMSS, which is a large HIT professional organization worldwide, actually. And I'm on the advisory board of the TAG Digital Health SIG. Today I'm representing Georgia Blockchain Coalition as an advisor there as well. I've been in large enterprises. This is one of the reasons I asked Michael to invite some people from the enterprise space with use cases, because I've been with the Coca-Cola Company and British Telecom as a legal manager, and Manhattan Associates, a local supply chain best-of-breed company as well. So I'm a little more familiar, rather than startups, which I've been involved in now over a year, I'm a little more familiar with the corporate world. And I think it's interesting, especially after the legal panel I had at 11 o'clock that was all startup focused. It's really interesting to say, okay, now what are the permissioned or private blockchains doing, and how is our corporations and enterprises actually enveloping and using blockchain or not? So we have an esteemed panel with us today that I'm very proud of. Our plan is to, I'm going to be introducing them, asking them different questions, and arguments are good. We almost had that. We had that a little bit on the legal panel. So actually more of a fireside chat. And then I definitely believe, and I'm already losing my voice, I believe in Q&A at the end. I honestly find when I've moderated panels before that is where you can get clarity, and great questions are always asked. So just be mindful that it is something that might be paramount or of interest to everyone else, and not just an opinion or something like that. So, without further ado, to my immediate right is Kevin Glidewell, who is an attorney, actually Associate General Counsel, having worked at Coke and British Telecom. That's a big deal. And he's in the Turner Sports sector at Turner, TBS, and on the innovation team. And there is another gentleman from his team in our audience, another executive from that team. So I welcome you as well. To his right is Paul Madsen. We're honored to have Paul here. I was watching his YouTube videos this week, and he's with Hedera Hashgraph, and their lead architect. And he's doing a presentation later where I'm sure he'll get more detailed into what they do, but we certainly want him to share what they do and share his opinions. And it may be a little, from my limited understanding, as I'm not a technologist, it may be a little different than the standard blockchain conversation. So that'll be very interesting. To his right is Kell Canty from Verity. He is the co-founder and CEO. It's a local startup. I believe you're at ATDC, right? Are you located? Yep, at one of our innovation centers. And involved in crypto auditing and the accounting space. And I think he works with Aprio as well, which is a firm, she's going to, there's someone speaking from Aprio also on the program if you want to learn more about that, get deeper into that aspect. And then at the very end, last but not least, is Jeff Beales. Jeff is with IBM as an intrapreneur and an executive with them in their supply chain group. As a lot of you, I'm sure in the blockchain space know, supply chain is one of the low-hanging fruits in terms of the applicability of blockchain to secure and fight against fraud and tracking and what have you. So this is going to be an interesting conversation. I wanted to start with a couple headlines and comments that I've been either sent or headlines from the news, just to tip it off and kind of get our focus. What should be on-chain and what should be off-chain in terms of immutability and privacy issues? Recently, there was a Deloitte study that stated 95, I found this hard to believe, 95% of all companies surveyed by Deloitte, which I assume not only are they reputable, it's not like they're a mom and pop shop, but I assume these are a lot of their clients that they had done this study with. 95% of those companies surveyed said they are investing in some sort of blockchain project. I found that a little hard to believe. 95 is huge. But there you have it. That was a study recently, only recently done. Question, why can't I sell my data like Facebook did and control it with GDPR standards? Why isn't our food and water supply traceable on something like a blockchain protocol and protected by the US FDA? Why are they not protecting us? albeit ERC-20 standards and other standards for interoperability, given the silos in typical business practices and the competition, where are we going with that? And the fourth revolution, as they recently said at the World Economic Forum, is of course going to be the Internet of Value. And I saw an article that actually had 50 examples of how blockchain is, quote, taking over the world. And yet we had also MIT this week announced that there's going to be a time, they say by the end of this year, when it's going to be boring to really talk about blockchain because it'll be so ubiquitous. So to kick things off, I wanted to start with Jeff at our far end and talk about, if you will, Jeff, what IBM is doing in this space, which of course they're leader. Yes, we know about Hyperledger and all of that, of course. But the one focus of interest that I have is food trust, which he'll explain what that is, which IBM is doing with Walmart, as well as other projects that they have. Thank you, Jeff.
Okay, thank you. I'm not sure if it's going to be boring that quickly, but...
No.
You know, as you mentioned, and I thought that was interesting on the Deloitte survey. I mean, IBM does see many companies looking to do blockchain-related projects. We've got at least, last count was over 500 different POCs, pilots, other activities going on with companies ranging from, you know, financial services, you know, medical-related, supply chain-related, a whole variety of industries, insurance products, everything. So I do see that blockchain is going to find its way into many of our processes. I think it will be ubiquitous. It's at some point. You know, we don't talk about today the details that are going on when you do, you know, internet transactions over your cell phone. So I think at some point that you know, blockchain is going to be embedded in many things that we do. Related to food trust, we started a project with Walmart probably over 2 years ago to begin looking at how to trace farm to a consumer different products that would be in the food supply chain. There's a high amount of obviously recalls that you see in the news around different, you know, produce products, those kinds of things. There's frustration with many of both suppliers, vendors, others in those networks when you do have to do those kinds of recalls. It's difficult to quickly target where the suspect, you know, produce or product might be. And in many cases, to be safe for the public in other ways, you end up throwing many things away that are probably fine. So as that project began developing, one of the early tests in that work was the Walmart team sat down all of their different functions, and this is not to say something bad about Walmart, but they sat down all their different functions to understand where a container of mangoes came from. And that process took the Walmart team 7 days to figure out where that particular box of mangoes, where was the source of those mangoes in their system. The blockchain process found it in 2.3 seconds. So being able to use and share information and in blockchains between many different sources, many different participants in the food supply chain allows Walmart and other retailers now are beginning to look at this as well, an opportunity to really change the dynamic on how food is we ensure the you know, the trustworthiness of the food that we consume as consumers, and that we change the way that even consumers may interact with products at the marketplace now. Being able to actually look up where those mangoes came from, you could, you know, there's actually discussions around putting apps on your phone so that consumers can look at that directly in the store to find out where, you know, what's the. So, you know, those are some of the things that are going on, at least in the food trust space. I would say the important thing about blockchains, and again, IBM's almost exclusively in permission blockchains, because they see that as a great value for business and business-to-business interactions, business-to-consumer interactions, is not everything, a blockchain doesn't fit every solution. So it's important to understand the use case well enough to make sure that blockchains are actually the right tool, the right solution for that particular business problem you're trying to solve. So that would be my comments around supply chain.
Good point. That's been heralded this morning as well, and it's a very good point to make. I also had known from Tom Savell, the doctor at CDC, that maybe IBM is working with you all as well as Consensus tracking TB, which I thought was fascinating, tuberculosis. And that may be something you cannot speak about, and that's okay if you can't. A project that might be quiet, but Tom has actually spoken about it publicly. I've seen him speak, yeah. I think that's just absolutely fascinating. That would be more public blockchain, obviously.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, we're doing situations like we are working with the country of Dubai. We actually have a blockchain to manage the interactions between that country and its citizens. So there's a whole blockchain being rolled out with the country of Dubai.
Wow, that's fabulous. Thanks. The next one I would like to turn to is Kevin. Kevin, so we have a big corporation here in town, another big corporation whose home is Atlanta, and learning, it was fascinating to meet with you and learn that you all are interested in tokenizing. And I learned for the first time an FTO, fan token offering. So if you could share what you all are doing, and again, share with us what you can share, and if there's secret sauce you're doing, we don't mind not being told about that, but would love to hear what you're doing around the sports arena and just kind of where you're
going. Yeah, sure. So this idea of fan token offering, Turner in the media space generally, like in this space, at large, it's still very early, and I think a lot of what I've been doing is just exploring and also educating internally, trying to understand the space, understand the different companies and projects in it, and then also share some of that information with our group internally. We have an emerging media team within Turner that's focused on learning about and evangelizing new technologies within the company. And so members of that group and members of our digital business are interested in blockchain and Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies and how they might be applied to the media sector or used in the media sector. The particular businesses I support are Turner's sports businesses. And so one set of projects that you're seeing crop up in the sports media space that is interesting is this idea of trying to do fan loyalty points or fan rewards or even fan membership type offerings on a blockchain. So you've got a university called Stephen F. Austin that has recently announced that it's going to put its fan membership system on a blockchain. And Paris Saint-Germain, the football club, did something similar. They've announced they're going to do a fan loyalty system on the blockchain. And I think, in the media space, it's always about how do you build that deeper connection with the fan, really get them coming back and engaging with you. And I think that's a lot of what makes those sorts of projects interesting to folks in sports and sports media is this idea of if a fan is rewarded with loyalty points or membership points, and instead of those points only living in, Paris Saint-Germain's closed app ecosystem, or in Stephen F. Austin's, closed online system, if those points are living on something that's more open or public, like a blockchain, and potentially become fungible, tradable, and potentially become more liquid on exchanges or through other systems that might make fan loyalty points or reward points interchangeable, does that offer value to the fan? Does it make the reward points and the membership program more valuable? Does it cause the fan to engage more often with the team or the membership system? So yeah, it's a good example of the kind of thing that I think is interesting to the sports space.
And I think it's good to note that you have an innovation sort of center at TBS. So we have in Atlanta a lot of companies that are rather staid companies, like a Coca-Cola, for instance, that's been around for many years, and yet they have an innovation center that at least is tossing around the idea of blockchain and the technology. And as we've heard earlier on the other panel and other speakers, it's not something obviously that you just slap on everything, and I think that's what everyone would agree. There has to be the perfect problem for which blockchain is the perfect solution. So even though there's going to be 95% of these companies that are using it, obviously it's going to disintermediate some industries, no question. Cal, if you could talk next about what you're doing at Verity and why there is some pain in taxing and accounting and whatever in companies that are getting involved in the blockchain and crypto space.
Yes, as more and more companies start to experiment and do POCs and get more involved with cryptocurrencies in general and other crypto assets, the degree of uncertainty around that within the gatekeepers of the world, so the accounting firms, the lawyers, the regulators, in terms of how do we verify these assets? How do we account for them? How do we know who truly owns them? How do we know what the transactions went to and from? You have certain organizations like the SEC and AICPA and PCOB that actually audits public companies. So if you have companies that are looking to be involved with assets that aren't a blockchain, if you think about the traditional model, if somebody is wondering, is this company solvent? What are the finances of this public company or private companies which get audited? Their investors, other people within the firm want to know what the activities are and want to know for certain that it's truthful. You would go to the traditional centralized financial entity. You go to Bank of America, you go to SunTrust, you go to Charles Schwab, and you say, I would like to prove, show me the account, and tell me as a centralized granting institution that this entity owns these funds and they've had these cash flows. And things of that nature have occurred because that's essential for the entire loan system, the entire regulatory system, the entire audit and accounting system. And right now, with the decentralization of blockchains, which I am a huge fan of and have been in the space since about 2012, there is no centralized way of doing that. Obviously, we're not going to have a centralized entity, but we at least need to start coming up with centralized protocols, or at least points where you can go through and say this, we can do verifications. We can do it across different chains, different tokens. We can prove ownership, rights, and obligations. And so we began back in 2014 helping a local accounting firm, Aprio, actually audit the crypto assets of the world's largest cryptocurrency payment processor. And we've extended beyond that, and now we help both crypto-owning companies and accounting firms to actually verify the assets, verify ownership and transactions. And in a way, we're helping bridge the world between the traditional centralized people of the regulators and the bankers and loan institutions and others to actually have a source of truth in terms of they're used to going to an entity or having a protocol by which they say, I just need to know that someone owns this, these transactions are real, and I'm not going to have 15 different internet sites around the world that I'm randomly going to and manually trying to collate everything. And it's got 18 decimal points and I'm having trouble. So we help address that issue, and by doing that, we think it brings more legitimacy to the world of blockchain and crypto assets, and helps aid the people who aren't used to the idea of decentralization have a way of coming and saying, I need verifications, and we can provide that. And so it helps bridge that gap for them.
Excellent, thank you. I'm going to add to that. So where do exchanges fit in what you're doing? And they've become a muddy, I know you're smiling now. Well, we had this discussion already on my legal panel, but exchanges are kind of, I don't know if the SEC, if you could address that. In terms of your world, yeah.
Yeah. So as a crypto person, I typically say, not your keys, not your crypto. So, and what that means is that people will commonly say, oh, I've got, 10 Bitcoin at an exchange. I've got, 15 Ethereum at another exchange. I've got these tokens on an exchange. You don't have anything. You have a promise. So if you're not familiar with that, most exchanges operate in terms of they have a pool of 150 or 1,000 Bitcoin or something like that. They have the private keys too. They own that, right? You come in and you give them fiat, and then when you say, I would like to buy 1 Bitcoin out of that pool, or you don't even know that the pool exists, they have some standard ledger within their software system, and they allocate. or they say they place a marker, right, a promise. And only at such time that you ask for redemption or sending of that cryptocurrency asset out of that pool do you ever actually possess the private key and technically own it. At any other time, you just have a non-guaranteed promise for delivery at some point, and typically, if it's not even the United States, from a completely different jurisdiction. So we've spent weeks and weeks with accounting firms. One top 10 accounting firm that we just dealt with, they say when they go to audit finances of a company or a hedge fund that has quote unquote crypto at an exchange, they treat it like an unsecured loan. Like you've given the fiat out and it may or may not ever come back. Wow. I'm part of the not your keys, not your crypto. And if you think about it, the best way to go about that is it's in the name, right? What is an exchange? It's for exchanging. It's not for holding funds. Mm. If you send fiat there and you exchange it for crypto, or if you send crypto and you exchange it for fiat, then go ahead and get it back into your wallet or get it back into your bank account. And, particularly when you have ones that aren't, there's no regulations around them really. Gemini is probably one of the best ones that has recently come out because they're granted license. They are a qualified custodian by the SEC. They've undergone what's known as a SOC audit, which is an extremely important thing that you'll see more and more in the industry. But you have someone like, I think everyone's familiar with the story of the Canadian exchange that didn't have adequate controls and processes and procedures and security, and who knows what's going on there, but $190 million are gone. So exchanges are for exchanging and not your keys, not your crypto.
Great comment. Thank you. How do states that are now working with crypto, whether to pay your taxes, or how is that coming into effect in the work that you're doing? The states are now, and we heard Carol, one of the attorneys that's speaking later from DC, talk about how states are going to get more and more, making more and more independent decisions. We've got 50 different decisions around how they're going to manage their crypto in each state. How is that going to affect the whole accounting and tax, ecosystem?
Obviously, any greater adoption is always great, and it's great to see a great company like BitPay help facilitate that with the state of Ohio. And there's great things going on in Wyoming and all that. And I don't want to be a Debbie Downer or whatever, but it's all great. But it doesn't matter till it happens at the federal level. That's my opinion. You'll see limited success or maybe a little bit more expansion locally, but until it happens at the federal level, among the CFTC, FinCEN, SEC, IRS, OCC, I think the state efforts are great and it always helps, but we need to see something at the federal level.
It's okay to be Debbie Downer for a moment anyway. So Paul, tell us what you're doing at Hedera. I think it's very exciting and we're anxious to hear, and how it differentiates, or you differentiate it from what else is going on in the whole blockchain technology.
Sure. First, as a Canadian, I'm going to push back on the many knocks we've gotten today. Jameson Lopp's session earlier cited 3 or 4 notable hacks that happened in Canada. We're doing our best up there.
Oh dear.
So I'm from Hedera. Hedera is an emerging public platform, a DLT, not a blockchain. I'll explain the distinction. Hedera is based on the Hashgraph consensus algorithm. And the fact that Hashgraph is not a blockchain, it does what blockchains do. It orders transactions. But because it does so differently, we think it has some noteworthy performance and security advantages. But in the context of enterprise adoption and use cases of public permissionless ledgers, I would suggest there are more notable differentiations between Hedera and other public permissionless DLTs or blockchains. The first of which is governance, right? We have a very admittedly different by design governance model than, as far as I know, all the other public ledgers. It's one that's inspired by Visa, 39 large global billion-dollar companies will ultimately be the council that has the authority to make the decisions about how the ledger should evolve. So not ad hoc, very formalized, perhaps intuitively centralized. It feels centralized, right? 39 established big businesses. I would suggest that in practice, it will probably be less centralized in the sense of resistance to collusion and coercion and all those bad things that ultimately decentralization is meant to avoid. And the other key notable feature is that because the patent itself is, well, because the algorithm itself is patented, then we can make a commitment to those dApps that build on us that other pure open source technologies can't. Specifically, that as much as we can control, we will inhibit forks. The premise being, enterprises want predictability and stability from a platform if they're going to put mission-critical enterprise data on it. And so, again, as much as we can control, there will be no Hedera coin, Hedera light, Hedera, any misspelling you can imagine that's meant to confuse investors.
Interesting. And where are you going with this in terms of customers or your focus, or what traction have you had in approaching enterprises and distinguishing yourself?
Yeah, so we're not just trying to sell into the enterprises. We think we have an attractive value proposition for enterprises. But over 100 dApps, startup distributed apps, have already announced that they will build on Hedera for the reasons of performance and security that I cited before. The fact that that governance council I described of eventually 39 large global enterprises, we think that will establish quite a significant draw because they will inevitably build their own apps on the platform that they've invested in, and that will pull their supply chain partners in, and there'll be a virtuous network effect. The end result of which is hopefully large-scale throughput that we think we can support, low latency distributed ledgers that can enable a new ecosystem of distributed apps.
Interesting. Is this? Would you call it a blockchain as a?
Well, the distinction has been made a number of times today between a blockchain and a DLT. Mm-hmm. We are a DLT. We no longer get offended if someone calls us a blockchain. We know what they meant.
And blockchain as a service, you wouldn't say that's what your platform?
No, we, like any other truly distributed platform, will manifest as software that is installed on nodes, ultimately thousands or millions of nodes around the world, like an Ethereum, like Bitcoin, and it'll be that node software that ultimately maintains the ledger.
Excellent. I also read that you have an affinity for the identity management systems that are out there, or maybe SSI, as we're learning, self-sovereign identity with GDPR and whatever that's, excuse me, I'm losing my voice already, that's coming down the pike. Could you comment on your interest in that? And then I'd love to hear from the other panelists about their comments with regard to GDPR and privacy issues and people owning their own data.
So, yes, before this world, I worked in the identity space. I spent probably about 10 years at an identity management firm selling into enterprises. And SSI, or self-sovereign identity, to some extent is just the latest version of a meme that's lived in the identity world for 10, 15 years. Mm. It's gone by different names, the basic premise of which give users more control over their identity, which is laudable, and I think we'd all want that. SSI really is just a reinvention of that basic value proposition with some ledgers in the mix, right? And using ledgers to to some extent, disintermediate companies like Facebook from who you are and where you want to get to, whether it's Facebook or your bank or whoever mediates your identity online. I'm somewhat cynical about SSI because I've seen this story, and I have a sense of what ledgers do well and what they don't do well. And it's not clear to me, at least, yet that ledgers are an absolutely necessary piece of SSI. That will offend many of my old identity peers, but that's fine.
And what will be the effect, whether it's in Canada or the U.S., on GDPR as it has been rolled out, and they're already fining a lot of U.S. large companies? And in your opinion, and I'll pass it to the rest of the panel. Yeah.
Canada, culturally, sociologically, tries to fit between the U.S. and Europe, so I think inevitably we'll see something like GDPR before you will in the U.S. GDPR is hard to reconcile with ledgers, right? Right to be forgotten. How do you forget something that is immutable?
Well,
good point. I was going to say, Kell, can you comment on that?
I mean, I think in a way this can drive a conversation about how you design blockchain systems. A lot of people talk about utilizing it for bigger data. Most blockchains can only handle extremely small amounts of data, and the majority of them use off-chain data. So this is really, the conversation about GDPR involves on-chain versus off-chain, because typically you'll have pointers in the on-chain immutable data pointing to off-chain data stores. And if you think about a properly designed system, the ability to invalidate that data store, the immutable part, is pointing to a data store that is off-chain and therefore can be removed. Actually, it's not quite the dichotomy that a lot of people think. A lot of people are mistaken in thinking that, the medical data or the credit data or whatever data is on the blockchain. It's not. Typically, the majority of time, for a wide variety of technical and procedural reasons, the traditional data stores used, any real system, including Fabric, do this, and then the actual pointers are kept on the blockchain. So it's not necessarily a problem, and I think well-designed blockchain systems like Fabric and others will allow invalidation of the data store for right to be forgotten and others, whereas we still can use the immutable pointers that if it's still there and hasn't been invalidated, it actually works out.
So just to clarify, maybe for some students and even for myself who's not a technologist, when you say on-chain and off-chain and describing that, it's more like a woman of a certain age with dark hair, and that's really all that's going to be, something like that, where those sorts of characteristics are on-chain, but off-chain would be my name, my...
No, not the thing that's on-chain would be, this is in this database with this 40-character long key, and this is the pointer to it, and if you want this information, go to there and get it. And if it's there and the hash of what's in the off-chain data matches the hash, so you store where it is, the pointer, as well as the hash of what it is. And if it matches up, then that's good to go, and you have the immutability part of those two factors within the on-chain blockchain data. But then you can invalidate it, and anything larger than a couple of bytes or 100 bytes, you're not going to store MRIs or credit data on-chain. It's all off-chain in a traditional database.
It is a matter of education, because there's no question that the consumers in general out there looking at blockchain think that everything's on-chain, and therefore their privacy is going to be an issue. And I've been in discussions at other conferences where privacy rights become a real heated discussion, but they don't understand what you just explained. So thank you. Go ahead, Paul. You want?
Well, yes, a properly designed system will implement it as Kell defined, but data sneaks onto ledgers, right? Like there was a recent example of pornographic material on the Bitcoin ledger. It happens, right? Because there's nobody preventing it from happening. So it can be an issue. That's a separate issue than GDPR, clearly, except for the actor.
Go ahead, Kevin.
Yeah, I was just saying, an interesting thing to me as a lawyer, and somebody who's been a lawyer for tech companies for a while now, about GDPR is the way it's GDPR and some of the scandals like Cambridge Analytica the last year or two have really pushed this conversation to the forefront of product design and technology design. it was such a ancillary part of the process for so many years. Notwithstanding the fact that regulators like the FTC and the European Data Protection Authority have been saying for years, when you're designing technological systems, you really need to start with privacy, and thinking about privacy as one of your first principles, the first thing you think about. But that hadn't really, at least in my mind, hadn't really been the case for most organizations until the last couple of years. And now everybody's aware of GDPR, they're aware of this pending California privacy legislation, and it's really sort of scared people straight on this idea of we need to have this conversation at the outset. And potentially this idea of how does my product deal with your user data, what sort of choices do you have, becomes not only a technological challenge you've got to overcome as you're designing your product, but also a potential selling point, something that you use to differentiate your offerings.
Yeah, I actually think that the conversation around privacy, which I think if we had mature IT organizations even centralized that, I've been hacked about 15 times. I have credit protection for life, so I'm kind of, that's already gone, right? I think privacy driving the conversation for decentralization and user control of their data and monetization of that is actually great. So if privacy is the key that unlocks the door to allow consumers and everyone to say, all right, who has access to my data and who's paying for it and what do I get from that, as opposed to giving it for free to Facebook and Equifax, which I would contend are the same companies, or at least have the same business model. That's the powerful thing that I think things like GDPR are going to drive, is the change in business model for decentralization and user control and monetization of their own data.
For instance, like clinical trials, which is what's being discussed now, right? Where you can offer and get paid for offering your data, which might already be being done by your doctor, and you don't even know that, or your insurance company.
Well, not necessarily, just who wants to sell me car ads, because I've posted something about driving, yesterday on Facebook in the mountains. That sort of thing. It's just complete generalized. Facebook and these other social media sites are harvesting all that data and selling it to all the advertisers. That's why they are the size they are. I get nothing from it.
That's right. How will the FTOs, how will the fans and reward systems maybe at TBS address or help the consumer and give them some monies around it, or rewards? Obviously they will, but.
What I think is really cool about this whole conversation is just the idea that it potentially introduces more options, both for product developers and for fans. I don't know if there are any MetaMask users in the audience. MetaMask is a browser plugin that allows you to interact with blockchains from your browser. So if you want to do something like trade non-fungible tokens or even swap, other Ethereum coins, you can do that in your browser using this little browser extension. And it's, maybe not from the deep technical perspective anonymous, but relatively anonymous, right? You're not entering your name, your individual name or your home address to use this MetaMask extension. You just use your MetaMask address to conduct these transactions. And once you've downloaded the extension, it's pretty frictionless to get in there and buy things and trade other tokens. And it, at least from the user perspective, seems relatively anonymous. You're not giving every single partner, every single publisher your name or your address. And I think some users might like that. And I actually think some product developers might like that, not having to deal with the data collection that has typically been required to facilitate e-commerce. And I just think having that option as a developer and a user is really cool.
Paul, do you have a comment?
Yeah, I think that's another key aspect of user empowerment, right? Removing the temptation of websites to need to collect PII and subsequently monetize it. So if the relationship and the interaction between a content provider and a user is monetized through micropayments, then you give that content provider an alternative revenue stream where they needn't collect and advertise to you. Instead, you charge 1/10 of a cent per blog article read. Speaking of extensions, we've built an extension that enables that so that a user can pay for content as they go. They needn't subscribe for a month. They needn't sign up for a year. They just buy as they read.
So we're already starting to get a little short of time. I had at least 3 questions I want each of the panelists to address or give an opinion on. Words of wisdom in this space. So you've been in this space, all of you, you're professionals, you're senior in your roles, and we've got all sorts of people in our audience, whether it's startups, whether it's those who are technologists like yourselves, or experts in their area, or students as well. What would be words of wisdom to impart? Maybe the number one thing that you would suggest as they are in this space, looking to be in this space, from what you've learned. And Jeff, I'll start with you.
Wow, words of wisdom. I think the key, at least that we've seen with blockchain applications, is certainly understanding the problem you're trying to solve. And again, back to my point, make sure that blockchain is the right tool for the solution that you're trying to solve. The second thing, and I think it came up a little bit in one of the earlier discussions around the governance. And again, we're many of our applications are working in a permissioned environment. So understanding how you're going to manage and govern that network once it becomes mature, I think it's important to kind of have a view of that when you start. And so those are I think the two big things that we've seen in terms of blockchains that are very critical.
Thank you. Kell?
So for enterprise and even middle market use, I would say correspondingly, understand the technology, understand what disintermediation can do with your business model, and don't try to have blockchain or DLT as a panacea or as a I can get funding for this type of scenario. Have it match or be beneficial to the business model you're trying to do.
Super. Thanks. Paul?
Yeah, I guess just a meta point is that it's so early. Everybody in this room knows more than 99.99% of the world's population about decentralization. And so I think we're allowed to experiment, and we're allowed, as a community, to try out different governance models. I was in the Decred, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, and their governance model is the exact opposite of Hedera's. One, it's on-chain, where end users have direct influence on governance. Completely different than Hedera. But that's okay, because we're all experimenting and trying out new things. And maybe the end state is something in the middle.
Thank you.
Mine is kind of similar to Paul's, just kind of, at least for me, it's just, trying to stay curious and open-minded, at least in the media space, having watched, the disruption caused by mobile phones and social media like Facebook and Twitter. If you went back 10 and 15 years and look at the predictions of how folks said those technologies were going to play out, they're all largely wrong. And so getting too wedded to one particular approach or idea early on, to me, just doesn't seem like the right approach. And so just say, allowing things that are toys or look like joke projects but are interesting to you, just having the curiosity and the open-mindedness to kind of stick with them and play around them but not be too wedded to them. That's how I try to approach it.
It's a great idea. Final question, and then we're going to take it to Q&A. Obviously, given Paul's comment, and he's totally right, we're still at the nascent stage of blockchain technology and crypto. However, I am delighted, from having only been involved since 2017, to go from Jennifer, is blockchain Bitcoin or Bitcoin blockchain, to actually waking up every day and seeing a different legitimate Fortune 500 company like a Walmart or what have you totally committed to the space, so that I don't have to explain to friends and family what it is. So that's been a pure delight, and it's moving. Of course, those of us in the space know that 3 months is like a year. I feel like I've been in the space for 10 years. So given all of that, if you all could look at your crystal ball and see, okay, what trends do you see? What things do you see happening? Are we going to be using tokens to pay our doctors in 5 years, in 2 years, in 10 years? What trends in your space could you project, or would you project, looking in your crystal balls for the future for our audience? Jeff, I'm going to start again with you.
Okay, that's fine. What we're already starting to see is, obviously, as we've done these permissioned networks, is they've largely been, I'll say, in a particular use case space. So we're starting to see opportunities for those networks to interoperate. So we're seeing network of networks beginning to build and connect. So I see that as a growing space.
Interoperability is huge.
I think we'll see. I think we're going to see some use of tokens. I don't know if it's going to be. I can't project how broad, but I think we're going to see use of tokens in certain applications that will be, help speed commerce. And I think the other thing is, each of us as individuals will begin to have touch points with blockchain in a very common way. So I think it will. I think certain use cases and applications will mature a little more rapidly than others. So I think we'll see some interactions where probably in spaces we didn't expect to see it.
Thanks, Kell.
I agree in the private or enterprise use that systems will probably end up just being, if blockchain is appropriate to it, it'll be built in, and it may not be that noticeable in the future. In the public and crypto asset part, I fully believe that stable coins are regulatory-wise and convenience and familiarity-wise gonna open up new venues for usage on a much broader basis. And I think kind of in a similar vein, that applications toward, say, major retailers using a crypto token, perhaps a stable one, that has prepaid aspects as well as loyalty aspects perhaps combined. If you look at something like a Best Buy card, how is that different than a stable coin or token issued by that gives buying ability within that franchise as well as tracks loyalty capabilities? So I think that's an interesting area that is also very regulatorily clear that I think may be experimented or growing adoption in the future.
Thank you. I wanted to mention stablecoins on the legal panel, and so I'm glad you mentioned it here. I appreciate that. Paul?
So I'll just note that because Jeff went first twice, he took my answer. I was going to talk about hybrid models where, some enterprise or supply chain maintains supply chain data, what have you, on their own fabric, perhaps, or comparable, but then settles to a public ledger, right? And so you use each appropriately. But I won't talk about that because Jeff took my answer. So my prediction is that the first killer app in the public world are micropayments, specifically the scenario I talked about before. That, to be clear, we are not the first to try to tackle that basic attention token. Lightning has been cited as an enabler for that. So while we use the coffee shop sort of as the archetypical consumer experience for crypto, I think it'll be a website reading an article.
Thank you, Ken.
And then I'll offer two, one general, one specific. General, I think these systems, open systems where you've got this, essentially user-generated money, user-generated communities that are doing this experimenting and improving these protocols. I just think that's really powerful. And 2018, 2019 has been this period where the mainstream press has been so dismissive of blockchain and Bitcoin because of the price crashes. But I'm ultimately still personally very bullish on the space and the technology, and it's because of those reasons. I just think if you look back and analogize it to social media and Facebook or Twitter, and you see how big those platforms got because of the creativity of the users using them and how open they were, I think the same thing applies here and a reason to be excited about the space. And then more specifically, everybody's familiar with the ICO crash and just how hot that market got and crazy it went. But I think that model of, essentially using open networks to crowdfund projects and crowdfund companies is so powerful that it is likely to come back in a more responsible and more regulated way.
Good comments. Appreciate it. Okay, we've got time for a couple questions. If you'll raise your hand. Yes, sir. Go ahead.
You guys give you this.
I think we can actually hear him, but okay.
Can you comment on where you think we are with blockchain architectural standards, technical standards, certification, NIST? Anybody that's doing standards, is there any common understanding about how to build blockchains that can be, for instance, if we wanted to certify a blockchain, you have a blockchain and we want to certify it, where would anybody start?
Paul, can you help with that? Or
Yeah, I wish I could. I don't have an answer. I don't know of any work, that's attempting to address that. Maybe, again, we're early. And there's still this Wild West to some extent of technologies.
I have an answer that no, there is no standard. It's an emerging field, and someone tries to give you a standard for certifying the blockchain when there's hundreds and obviously new entrants that are experimenting with new functionality, then you should look at that skeptically.
So, but I could imagine a standard for the characteristics that you'd want of a blockchain, right?
Or maybe best practice.
Don't put PII on a public chain to your point, right? Like, prevent the obvious mistakes.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, this was a great panel. I have two questions, I promise. So last year we did a conference in Kell. You were there at Emory Law. It was fantastic. But one of the things that came up was the regulatory space. So my broad open question is, where are we a year later in terms of advances in regulatory work? And I think I recall you testifying or speaking with some regulators in DC. So that's part one. Part two would be looking at blockchain, DLT, however you want to describe it, plus AI. And where are we with thinking about blockchain and an artificial intelligence combined use case?
And Nicole is with Georgia Tech and Emory Tiger, by the way. Go ahead, Cal.
I'll address the second question. So we've been looking at both actually the combination of AI, IoT, and blockchains, because we see that intersection between those three to be very powerful. So, from the IoT perspective, it's going to allow again, ensuring the security of the data coming in through your IoT device, but it allows smart contracts to execute very quickly on the blockchain itself, so we can automate some of those types of tasks. And then in terms of the AI piece, it does give us another source of structured data in which to look at, and then having access to unstructured data that may be off-chain to I'll say increase our predictions around that particular transaction or process that we're looking at. So we're seeing we do see the combination of those three coming together, and blockchain being a key piece of that solution.
In regards to regulators, I think we've gotten Bitcoin's not a security, Ethereum's not a security because it's sufficiently decentralized, whatever that means. Other than that, the tone has been more of treating everything as a security, unless proven not, and then even to the extent, it seems that we're getting legislation or at least regulation by the standpoint of case law, which is not a preferable way for people to operate, because you're not sure where it is until they start playing kind of like bumper pool. They're going to move you this way by suing someone who's doing that, and then everyone goes, "Oh, we shouldn't do that." Instead of having a clear roadmap. So I'm somewhat disappointed in that, but we're hearing things. So, for instance, with one of our clients, we're implementing a policy that one of the major law firms has put out that I think they heard from advice from the SEC, is that if you're issuing a token, treat yourself as if you were a publicly traded company, so that we are registering all the insiders that have information and monitoring wallets for any front running of trades. So we use our system to help our client do that in being preparation, but that came about through back channels, which is unfortunate, but maybe in the future.
Go ahead, Kevin.
I was just going to say on the point about regulation by case law and whether or not that's a surprise or not. And this is, I guess, my turn to be Debbie Downer. So if you look back at online copyright law post the enactment of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, everybody thought that should have cleared up online copyright infringement issues, and it didn't. You had a piece of federal legislation which you thought would have cleared things up. Still, big companies at least, and users were confused, and what you ended up with was 10 years of copyright litigation to really sort out the rules of the road for online copyright. So I hope that's not the answer in this space, but it at least was in that space.
I'll just add that the SEC is listening. We've had long-running discussions with them. educating them as to our technology and why the utility of our token we think is obvious. So I'm encouraged by the fact. Clearly, they're having similar discussions with other platforms too.
Thank you. I'm afraid that we're done with time. I know you have other questions, and I'm hoping our panel will be available, or panelists will be available for each of you when we're done here, because we've got the next presentation to go. If you all will please thank me for these prestigious people that we've had here today.